Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, very glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. We have good, bad, and very crazy and very bad combo for our third martini. Today, let's start with the good, and one of the things we've been following for about a year now, Jim, is the incredible run of total fraud perpetrated by George Santos, the Republican member of Congress from Long Island, but who knows for how long now, because the House Ethics Committee has released its long-awaited report on Santos, with USA Today and many others here, of course, concluding there is, quote, substantial evidence that Representative Santos violated federal criminal laws. The story says the committee found evidence supporting allegations against Santos that he sought to exploit his House campaign for his own personal benefit, blatantly stole from his own campaign, deceived campaign donors to make payments for his own personal benefits, lied about his campaign finances, and sustained all of his criminal activities through lying to his constituents, donors, and staff about his background. Quote, Representative George Santos cannot be trusted. At nearly every opportunity, he placed his desire for private gain above his duty to uphold the Constitution, federal law, and ethical principles, unquote. So, Jim, we had a vote in the House trying to expel George Santos a number of days ago. It failed. One of the arguments against expulsion at that time was, well, this is before the Ethics Committee. Let's see what they report. We now have the report, so I'm sure there'll be a stronger push for this. The only expulsion you and I can probably remember in Congress is Jim Trafficant about 20 years ago. And at that time, he had also been convicted in federal court, in addition to the Ethics Committee continuing and completing its process. So I don't know how much longer George Santos will have in Congress, one way or the other. The good news here is he says he won't run for re-election. Not that it would have made any difference anyway, but hopefully we can get a Republican in that seat, and hopefully this truly bizarre tale will soon be behind us.
You know, Greg, when I thought when I first saw the headlines about this, that this indicated that the consequences for Santos were not going to be that severe, I went back and I checked, and People magazine, everybody's favorite news source, has the headline, George Santos will not face punishment from House Ethics Committee after months-long investigation. Now, from that headline, you'd think, oh, my goodness, they let him off the hook. Well, it's not, and then you go further and it says they will release details of the investigation, allow lawmakers to come to their own conclusions. Again, this is about as scathing a report as you will find. Right? They mince no words. They make no excuses. They just, lambaste Santos from beginning to end. And I think this is, there's almost a subtext here of we're not going to take action because it looks like this guy's going to jail, I think is a reasonable interpretation of it. So one, good riddance. I think this probably means the effort to expel Santos can come to an end. There's now a Band-Aid on the bleeding. It's good that he's leaving. You'd like to see him leave as soon as possible, but because they've had past votes and it has not yet met the threshold, and I think that it does, there's a fairly high threshold for the expulsion of a House member. This is a adequate solution. It's not the ideal solution. You'd like to see him go as quickly as possible. Marvin K. Mooney, will you please leave now or go now? But good riddance, George Santos. This is a step in the right direction, and hopefully he will be a little remembered joke and embarrassment to the institution, insulting the good name of, previous congressmen like Jim Trafficant, the dead squirrel that was on top of his head.
Jim Trafficant was at least entertaining. And he voted for Republican ideas once in a while in that blue collar district. But
beam me up, Mr. Speaker. He was always, the scandals that bugged him were generally the same ones but I wanted everything made in America. That were the two things that he stood for. He didn't like other people's scandals. His were just fine.
We don't condone what he did, but he was entertaining and he wasn't, hopeless on some of the issues. But nonetheless, looks like we're getting closer to the end of the George Santos saga, and it really can't come soon enough. Looks like it'll be through the electoral process. But nonetheless, he's got quite a bit of court activity in front of him as well. All right, Jim, let's talk now about our fantastic sponsor for the day, and that is 4Patriots, makers of the best-selling 4Patriots survival food kits. These are delicious tasting food kits. They're designed to last for 25 years when stored properly. They're not giving you cheap and lousy food. They come with real meat and vegetables. They're perfect for taking on camping trips or picnics. They're extremely portable, but most importantly, they're really good in an emergency. So if your power is out or, a month or two from now, you get snowed in with a big blizzard. We're supposed to get more snow than usual here in DC. We'll believe it when we see it, but if you live in some of those areas of the country that tends to get a lot of snow and could get housebound for a few days, have some stuff on hand. That way you don't have to stress it. Just boil water over a fire, simmer and serve. Enjoy hot meals and stay safe in a crisis. Visit 4patriots.com/martini to see this week's discounts and deals before they are gone and get free shipping on orders over $97. Save more and get peace of mind now by going to the number 4patriots.com/martini. That's 4patriots.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini now. And just one day after the huge pro-Israel rally on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which by all accounts was peaceful and no altercations with police, we kind of contrasted yesterday how they look different than the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. And we got another example of that yesterday outside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Some House leaders were inside, including the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Catherine Clark, the House Minority Whip. And so outside, demonstrators gathered. They clashed with police. At least 6 police were injured. And here's just kind of a little sample of what it sounded like outside those DNC headquarters on Wednesday evening. So, Jim, we're going to talk more about the ideology of some of these young people in our third martini, but the contrast between the violence and the hate and the confrontation that we see in this situation from Wednesday, which looks a lot like the other pro-Palestinian, or some would say pro-Hamas demonstrations, and what we saw in the mall on Tuesday, it's not hard to see the contrast.
Greg, I saw some discussion of this, protests getting violent outside of DNC headquarters. As it was happening on Twitter, people were, uploading videos. And, I saw a lot of people saying, this looks like a January 6th situation. Okay, well, it's probably not on the scale of January 6th. It's not all over the Capitol. The size of the protesters and people getting out of control isn't on the scale of January 6th. But it's not nothing. I think the audio gives you a small taste of it. I'd urge listeners to, catch the video. About 200 protesters, not thousands like January 6th, but, enough people to do some damage. And they did clash with cops. And there was spraying of pepper spray at cops and things like that. This, and so you'd think, first of all, this is bad. And this is, I think, a very stark contrast between the attitude of those who support Israel and went out on Tuesday and did not have any incidents and did not have any violence and did not have any, disruptions, confrontations, things like that. And the protesters who side with Palestine, wink, wink. Some of us would argue their actions are functionally pro-Hamas. But also just kind of this general attitude of they do want violence. They are eager to have confrontations with police. Now, some of this is that they are anti-establishment. They are anti the authorities. They are anti the position of the U.S. government right now. But I also think it's something very clear in their mentality that violence is justified, that they are entitled to push people around and to get into confrontations with cops. And by the way, if you go to Capitol Hill and you want to protest, you should kind of recognize that after January 6th, the U.S. Capitol Police they're not going to underreact to anything. They're not going to do anything halfway. They're not going to have a light touch. They're going to do everything they can to ensure that they have control of the situation, that they can ensure the safety of members of Congress and their staff as quickly as possible. So the other thing is that I did see, apparently there was an online coverage of the protest in the Washington Post today. I don't know if it made the print editions. It'll be interesting to see if there's anything in tomorrow's print edition. Other folks were saying next to nothing in the New York Times. There was a stray article in CNN, but it wasn't linked on the front page. It was just not treated as a huge deal. And I think in light of the coverage of January 6th, again, it's not proportional to what happened on January 6th, but the nature of what happened, i.e., ideologically charged angry protesters clashing with cops, you think that'd be news. You think that'd be a big deal. And the fact that this isn't getting a great deal of coverage indicates, I think, that there's a good portion of people in the mainstream media who are embarrassed by this and don't want America to know that there are angry leftists clashing with cops on Capitol Hill in a manner uncomfortably reminiscent of what happened on January 6th.
So, Jim, are you making the outlandish claim that if the exact same circumstances had played out yesterday, but the demonstrators had been on the political right, that we'd have a different amount and tone of coverage? I'm shocked.
I was going to say, we could, the old Jewish man who died in Los Angeles could have been treated as huge news, coast to coast. And it wasn't. A lot of news events. Does it fit the narrative that people in power would like you to have? And if it would make you feel worse about Democrats, feel worse about the left, feel worse about progressives, then it's just a story that happened with no broader implications. There's check the box coverage, not saturation or drumbeat coverage.
Absolutely amazing, but not surprised. Not surprised at all.
Have you ever played Monopoly? The purpose of the game is to build wealth by buying assets and profit. Are you playing the game by just passing go and collecting $200 without staying out of jail? Where does that go in the long run? Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast.
All right, Jim, on to our really bad and really crazy martini here. And you and I are not on TikTok, so it's not often that we are privy to TikTok trends unless they actually bleed into the areas that we pay attention to. And that is where we are now. Remember, this is Chinese spyware. And based on reports that we've seen from the Special House Committee on China and elsewhere, what gets pushed to the top on TikTok in the United States compared to what gets pushed to the top of TikTok in China, two very different things. So keep in mind what is actually happening here. This may be what China wants young people to focus on. But what's happening here is that magically, a bunch of young people have gotten their hands on a copy of Osama bin Laden's letter to America in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, explaining why, in his estimation, they were necessary. And now you've got all these useful idiots essentially saying, you know what, bin Laden, he had a point. He really had a point. So here, thanks to Libs of TikTok on Twitter for compiling some of these morons. Here's what they had to say.
Actually, before you even read the letter, I did want to mention, in reading the letter, I could only think of this tweet that I saw the other day. Under settler colonialism, any kind of resistance is branded as terrorist because the only acceptable violence is violence by the occupier. So please keep that in mind when reading the letter.
We really need to stop paying taxes because they ain't doing nothing but messing up everybody else. And America is the bully. And it's sad because they have brainwashed us to think that we was the best country on the planet. When in reality, we're the worst country on the planet.
It is just insane because this letter is so well written and so reasonably structured in an argument. Like, you got to present your findings. You got to state your cause, all of that. Like, everything he said was valid.
Anyway, Jim, these people define useful idiots, obviously. And if anybody's been paying attention for the last month and a week here, this shouldn't come as a surprise. But if terrorists ever strike this country again at any magnitude, whether it's 9/11 or bigger or smaller, these same people that are beclowning themselves and being so hateful on campus and elsewhere in our society are going to have the exact same attitude against our own country.
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate this. I think one of these short TikTok videos talking about how reasonable bin Laden sounded, it's got like 1 million views, which is a lot. That's still very bad. It does not mean that the necessarily a teenager down the street that you see walking down the street is a now hardy believer in Osama bin Laden. But I think we'd like the number of young people on TikTok who think Osama bin Laden was reasonable and who made a lot of good points. We'd like that number to be 0. And if it can't be 0, we'd like that to be as close to that as possible. And the fact that this has gone viral is extraordinarily disturbing. First of all, you kind of wonder how many of these people actually read it, because as my colleague Charlie Cook points out, like, in this letter, he says everyone must convert to Islam. In this letter, he says there are no innocent Americans because everyone pays taxes that fund the American military. Ergo, American women, children, elderly, et cetera, are legitimate targets. Like, do you really believe that? Or did you just get to you saw him bashing Israel and you're like, wow, bin Laden's got some good points there. That was the topic of today's Morning Jolt newsletter. And I tried to chew over a couple of points, Greg. And one of them is, for you and me, and I suspect for a decent number of our listeners, 9/11 in our heads is never going to be that far away. And in our heads, it was like it's a few years ago. Obviously, it is now 22 years ago, a little bit more than 22 years ago. And so all these things that we remember from that day to the days afterwards, the fear of the anthrax mailings and the immediately afterwards, let's roll, all these things that in our mind are vivid and fresh, and probably 20 years from now, 40 years from now, we're still all going to remember them like they were yesterday. For my kids, for your kids, for anybody who's really under their late 20s, they don't have any living memory of that. And in fact, if you're a teenager, you probably don't even have any living memory of the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. So to today's young people, the 9/11 attacks are as old, are the same way that to us in Generation X, the JFK assassination was. It was a thing that happened before we were born. Our parents feel very terrible about it, but we don't remember it. And it's just this thing in history. Right? And so one, I think that does make people fertile ground for conspiracy theories. I think it also is a demonstration of the fact that bin Laden, has now been dead. He died in 2011, so we're dead for 12 years. We don't really worry about Al Qaeda that much. ISIS a bit, but even ISIS has been significantly degraded from what it was. There is no Islamic State anymore, so we don't really worry that much about Islamist terror, or maybe not until the Hamas massacre on October 7th. The funny thing is, if you talk to us in September 12th, 2001, what do you want to happen in the year 2023? If somebody said bin Laden is a memory and nobody remembers much about Al Qaeda anymore, we'd think that'd be like a phenomenal victory. So, Greg, I started wondering, maybe we did a little too well. maybe the threat of Islamist terror has been so well dispelled that somebody can come along and attempt to rewrite the image or propagandize people into believing that Osama bin Laden was this principled activist and this, that he made some legit points. And he's been so forgotten that people buy into it, or that people can be sold into it. It's also possible that these people are the same ones who were eating Tide Pods a few years ago, Greg. And I'd really like them to go back to that. Not because I necessarily want them to die or have terrible health effects. I'm just saying I think eating Tide Pods is slightly less self-destructive and bad for you than believing that Osama bin Laden had some valid points.
If you're too young to remember the ISIS-inspired attacks in this country, whether it's San Bernardino or Orlando, which was 2016, ask somebody about them, for heaven's sake. Don't just spout off without knowing anything about what you're talking about, because that is not ancient history. That's 7 years ago that we were dealing with that kind of stuff. And I don't know how this stuff exactly gets viral other than Chinese algorithms, but somebody wants it out there. And it's obvious from the size of the demonstrations and the defense of Hamas that it's not an isolated situation. I was visiting with a good friend of mine who was in town for the Federalist Society event here in Washington last week. And one of the big speakers there was Barry Weiss. And he says one of the big takeaways that she passed on to the Federalist Society wasn't really a legal observation, but it's no longer in the eyes of young people, particularly young progressives. It's not about right or wrong anymore. It's about the critical theory of who's the oppressor in their eyes and who's oppressed, who has power in a situation. And if they've got power or the upper hand militarily or otherwise, well, they're instinctively the bad guy then. And so we're no longer dealing with questions of morality or what's best for U.S. national security policy. Instead, it's about which one is perceived as being in a position of being oppressed. And so if you don't think this stuff matters when it's being implemented in your schools and on campus, it does. You're seeing it right now.
Yeah, and I'll just like who is powerful and who is powerless is, I'm going to say at minimum, an insufficient way of looking at the world. How you behave, how you act, how you treat people, all of that matters a great deal. Not just, who is perceived to have more power in a particular interaction. And, what are the consequences of your actions seems like a really important one that can't be just hand waved away. But anyway, I saw this. And again, this doesn't mean, let's not overstate this. Let's not overdo this. Also, by the way, this is an indication. TikTok's algorithms steer people towards bad material, right? Whether it's sexually explicit material featuring underage people or ideologically extreme stuff or self-destructive stuff that's promoting bulimia, stuff like that. Like, the algorithm does not steer you to the good, healthy stuff. Oh, by the way, notice that you can't get onto TikTok in China. China realized it has created something that is like mental poison. And then it put it over here, and we tried to ban it, or there was an effort to ban it, couldn't get enough votes. And now we're living with the consequences of that. So look, if that algorithm, like if you this way, put something on TikTok that argues that violent attacks against the Chinese government are justified, and let's see how the algorithm handles that one, Greg.
Exactly. I mean, I hope this is a niche, but I don't know that it is, because I think this is while you were in Taiwan, and as Stepman was with us, we were looking at a CNN poll that showed out of 18 to 24-year-olds, 51% think the Hamas attacks were justified. From 25 to 34, it was 48 or 49. So between 18 and 34, basically half of Americans think that Hamas was justified. That's a big problem.
It is. And you'd really like to sit down and say, walk me through your thinking on that. My sneaking suspicion is that most people could not put together a coherent argument. Like whether it would, like when you see people tearing down the signs and, they get caught on camera and they say, why did you do that? They'll often say it's lies. They're not kidnapped. This is all IDF propaganda. And I just wonder if they're operating on that level of psychological denial. My sneaking suspicion is that a lot of people in this country, like you hear about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and you develop your attitudes about it. And I think, as you discussed this perception of power, some people looked at it and said, well, the Israelis are more powerful than the Palestinians. By the way, once you throw in Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, et cetera, I'm not so sure that Israel is more powerful. But anyway, and they decided, well, the Palestinians are the good guys here. And then something like the Hamas massacre happens. And they had already pushed all their chips on the poker table onto the idea that the Palestinians would be seen as the good guys. And they bet big and they lost. And they're so, they just can't deal with it. Psychologically, they have to insist that those people aren't really hostages. And they have to insist that the babies weren't killed. And they have to insist that the toddlers weren't killed. Because otherwise, it would mean they've been rooting for a terrorist group all along. And I think it's just too much for them to handle. And they just break, they snap. And they insist it can't be the case. I think that's what's at work here. Or we have young people who genuinely root for terrorists, which is, even worse.
Yeah, they think that because we're powerful, that we're the bad guy in most situations, which is not good. But I'll give you one extra good martini. We finished the podcast today. If you guys knew how much Jim and I went through to make this happen today, I think this is a sterling achievement of the highest order.
Let's be clear. A stampeding herd of elephants came through your home office and mine, trying to get this while we were getting this done. It's just that bad.
Glad to do it. We'll do it again tomorrow. Jim, see you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, and please tell your friends about us as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. They really do help us. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a good Thursday. Join us again Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.